Well, as I guess you know by now, I'm Warren Sanford. My wife's Kristen Kaur, my campaign manager and doctor of physical therapy here in Flagstaff. And if you haven't had a chance to meet everyone, Cynthia Zhang is a lecturer in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice, although now moving to Pueblo to take up as a lecturer position in sociology.
Right.
Cynthia and I shared some time together at NAU this year when I was guest lecturing for the department, and I really appreciate that opportunity to be part of
Students love you.
It was a lot of fun. So nice to meet you as well, Professor Han from the Department of Geography, yes. And Kristen and I embarked on this endeavor to run for Justice of the Peace back in October of last year. And when we announced our campaign, we were told by some of the pundits and some of our friends that have experience in this kind of thing that, gee, you're starting awfully early. That's going to be a long, sustained campaign. And indeed it has been. It's really run kind of both of us into an area of, well, outside of our comfort zone largely. I mean, we had largely were entertaining and embracing semi-retirement, and we're ready to just work more on that and essentially live more with less, as our mantra is. But in the 13 years that I've served the judiciary here in Coconino County, I was appointed to the Coconino County Judiciary in 2001 as a pro tem judge, and I have served as a judge in our lower courts, the Flagstaff Justice Court and the Flagstaff Municipal Court, since that time, for 13 years. I'm also appointed in the City of Williams, the City of Page, and the Justice Courts in both of those precincts as well. So in the time I've spent in the judiciary, I've really come to appreciate and embrace this remarkable diversity in Coconino County of thought, action, culture, indeed ethnicity, and have really found it fascinating to, well, be part of resolving disputes in varying areas of diversity. That was my background in college. I did a master's degree in public administration, including judicial administration, and I emphasized in alternate justice models, international justice models. I've studied Navajo peacemaking. I've studied the Maori out of New Zealand and their family group conferencing, the South African Initiative for Restorative Justice, and have really come to embrace a more success-based outcome in how we come to frame our understanding of disputes and how we resolve those disputes. One of the, I guess, privileges of being human is that we all make mistakes that at some point we later come to regret. That's just a human universal. We all will make mistakes. We all come to regret those mistakes, but yet it's how we respond to the consequences of choices that we make that largely will define our character and define who we are as a society. How are we framing disputes, how are we understanding disputes, and how are we working to resolve those disputes? And so I take the position that in this country, in the United States, we have a serious problem with mass incarceration of nonviolent offenders. The United States has 5% of the world's population, and yet 25% of the world's incarcerated population is here in the United States. And that's been in about the last 30 years. In fact, as recently as 30 years ago, it was 1 in 125 children had a parent in prison. Today that number is closer to 1 in 28. In fact, Sesame Street has a new character. What's his name?
Alex.
Alex is a new character in Sesame Street that has an incarcerated parent. And we're teaching children that this is becoming more of a norm than it is the exception, the vast exception that it used to be. And we know that children who come from, and by the way, of those 2.5 million people that are in this country that are incarcerated, fully 2/3 of them are nonviolent offenders. And half of those are or were, at the time of their incarceration, the sole income provider for children under the age of 18. And we know that children who come from, and an unstable household where a parent is incarcerated particularly, those children are more than 50% more likely to experience food insecurities, to have developmental delays, and essentially to be more likely to enter into this whole school to prison pipeline that we're seeing in the United States. Michelle Alexander has a good book that I encourage you to be familiar with. It's called The New Jim Crow, and it describes how we have militarized our local police forces, how we have targeted particularly our most vulnerable populations of people of color and people of low socioeconomic means, and this whole war on drugs, the 3 strikes you're out, the truth in sentencing laws are what's causing our mass incarceration rate. Arizona, 25 years ago, spent 18% of its budget educating our children and 4% of its budget on incarceration. Today those numbers are reversed. In Arizona we spend more than 4 times as much incarcerating people as we do educating people. And largely that starts when people enter the justice system at the lower levels, in the municipal courts and the justice courts. And so the decision that we made together last year to undertake this endeavor to run for Justice of the Peace was largely premised on the fact that we need reform. Court reform is so desperately needed in this country to heal the social and economic costs that we're experiencing as a result of mass incarceration of nonviolent offenders. And I mention nonviolent offenders because that's the majority of who we do incarcerate in this country. Granted, there are a lot of people in our jails and prisons who desperately deserve to be there, but the far greater majority are so much better served with alternatives to incarceration, success-based outcomes, including restorative justice, which is one of my passions and specialties from my graduate studies. And restorative justice is becoming more and more the forefront of this movement that includes all the stakeholders in deviance or in the outcome of a crime, and that includes the victim, certainly, reparations to the victim, what does it mean to make a victim whole, but also the community as a whole. The communities are harmed by crime in the lack of confidence in our ability to maintain a just peace in our community. And then certainly the offender, not least, is harmed by crime. Offenders are more likely to recidivate after serving in a term of incarceration. And right now the recidivism rates in Arizona are in excess of 45%, closer to 48%, and that's average for misdemeanors and felonies alike. Felony recidivism rates are pushing 70%. Restorative justice has a far greater success rate and lower recidivism rates. In fact, there's a program in Yavapai County where the recidivism rates are nearing single digit, I think about 12%. So roughly a quarter of what they are as the average for punitive-based justice models. Punitive justice goes back some 4,000 years to the Code of Hammurabi, ancient Mesopotamia. The Code of Hammurabi was one of our first codified, first written, known laws that was put into effect, and it essentially says an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. You know what Gandhi said about that? Right? Makes the whole world go blind, and that's what we're seeing in this country. Is now